Yeah, so there's the question: has Christianity caused wars? This, I should explain, is actually an ALS seminar that we're taking this afternoon. And the reading we've taken is from very early in the Bible, and we saw it was all about the opposite of war. It was about treating people with decency and respect, not discriminating against someone who's disabled. If they're blind or deaf, they're not to be made fun of or treated badly. If somebody's a sojourner, an incomer, or an immigrant, they're not to be discriminated against. It's all about treating people justly and mercifully, and even more than that, you're to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that is the teaching there from the early part of the Bible. People sometimes say, oh, well, the God of the Old Testament is a God of judgment, and the God of the New Testament is the God of love. But actually, it's the same God throughout. And God there in the Old Testament is saying that we should treat each other well. And yet people say Christianity has caused war. Richard Nixon, who was president of America for a while, wrote that the bloodiest wars in history have been religious wars. He wasn't saying specifically that Christianity has caused war. Walter Stacey, another American, is a bit humorous what he's saying. Men have gone to war to cut each other's throats because they couldn't agree what was to become of them after their throats were cut. Really is saying some people say there's life after death, and there's dispute as to what form life after death will take, and people actually go to war over such things. What's to become of them after their throats are cut. Robert Burns, the poet, pointing out the contradiction in Christians going to war. You hypocrites, are these your pranks to murder men and give God thanks? Desist, for shame, proceed no further. God won't accept your thanks for murder. That was when they had a national day of thanksgiving for a victory in a war. Schopenhauer, the German-Polish philosopher, talked about the fruits of Christianity. Now, in the epistles, we're told about the fruits of the Spirit. And Schopenhauer said, no, those aren't the fruits of Christianity. He said the fruits of Christianity were religious wars. So he very firmly believed that Christianity had caused war. Dawkins, perhaps the most famous of the proselytizing atheists in this country at the moment, I never thought I'd agree with him, but he said or wrote, my point is not that religion is the motivation for wars, but that religion is the principal label and the most dangerous one. So I think he's saying that people have a predisposition to go to war, and very often they claim that they're fighting for a matter of religious principle or religious belief. But if it wasn't that, they'd still be going to war and fighting about something else. Well, it's nice to think that, but this picture shows a dreadful slaughter taking place, if you can see the picture and see the detail. There's somebody been killed in the bottom left. He's about to be dumped in the river, and just by there, there's a mother who's been murdered and her baby and her child lying on the ground nearby, and then somebody else has been knocked down. There's a lot of blood. In the top right, there's a gibbet with people hanging off, and under the gibbet, there's a headless corpse being dragged along. So it's full of slaughter. There's somebody being thrown out of a window of that tower in the middle of the picture, and at the top of the left hand of those buildings, there's somebody being thrown off the balcony. So there's violence everywhere you look in this picture. And sadly, it's not illustrating a mythical story. It's an artist's impression of a real event. In 1572, a massacre in Paris. And it depends who you listen to as to how many people were actually massacred, murdered that day. Somewhere between 5,000 and 30,000, even if it were as few as 5,000 murdered on one day in one city. It's absolutely shocking. And it was in the purported cause of religion. It was, on this occasion, it was Catholics who were massacring Protestants, but sometimes, of course, it was the other way. So two groups, both claiming to be Christian, were massacring each other, allegedly, in the cause of Christianity. So one can understand why Schopenhauer made his claim. And looking at history, there have been religious wars, lots of them. There were the Crusades, which went on for, 200 years. And again, depending on whom you listen to, somewhere between 1 and 3 million people killed. And that was Islam versus Christianity. And moving on 300 years, we come to the French religious wars, which went on 30 years or so, and included that Bartholomew's Day massacre, Protestants versus Catholics, and perhaps as many as 4 million people killed in those, in France. And moving on another 100 years or 110, 120 years, again, Protestants against Catholics in the 30 Years' War, and perhaps as many as 11 million people killed. All a very long time ago. Have we moved on since then? 20th century, the Nigerian Civil War, again, Islam against Christianity, up to 3 million people killed. It's pretty bleak. Move on a bit further, the Lebanese Civil War towards the end of the 20th century. That was two different kinds of Muslims fighting against each other, perhaps 250,000 people killed, and even spilling over into the 21st century. We've got things like the Sudanese Civil War, where up to 2 million people were killed. So we cannot deny that there have been wars in the name of religion, not always Christianity, but often involving people who claimed to be Christian, and terrible atrocities have been carried out in the name of the religions, in the name of Christianity. So let's look at the facts of history. There have been wars, as we've seen, between Muslims and Christians, between different kinds of Muslims, between different kinds of Christians, so-called, but whoever's fighting, they've caused trouble, they've caused war, they've caused suffering. But we're going to see what the Bible says about this, and we'll say that really Bible teaching throughout the Bible is, as we read in Leviticus there, and it was against this sort of strife. We'll see that in the first few centuries of Christianity, at the beginning of Christianity, it wasn't so, but soon politicians took control of the church and they changed the beliefs and practices of Christianity. They took control of the religion, but they modified it. So it wasn't the original religion that Jesus taught, that was taught in the Bible, but it was modified for their own purposes by the leaders, by politicians and others. And so the suffering that's blamed on Christianity, it doesn't come from the Bible message, it's the result of politics. Politicians used Christianity for their own purposes. So let's look very briefly at the teaching of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. You see what Jesus was saying. Don't retaliate. Someone attacks you, let them. Don't fight back. And actually, he was quoting the Old Testament there, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That wasn't really a call to exact revenge. It was actually limiting the compensation you could receive if you suffered damage. You weren't to kill somebody because he knocked your tooth out. The best you could exact would be, well, one of his teeth, but more likely it would be monetary compensation commensurate with the loss of a tooth. Jesus went on to say, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That's not a quote from the Bible, at least it's a half quote from the Old Testament. You shall love your neighbor, as we read in Leviticus there, and we'll look at it again in a moment. But hate your enemy, that doesn't come from the Old Testament. That was added on by others. And Jesus said, but I say to you, love your enemies. So men said, hate your enemies. Jesus said, love your enemies. So that's the teaching of Christianity. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. So the teaching of Christianity is the exact opposite of causing wars. It's about making peace. So this isn't teaching that causes war. And people say, oh, well, that's the New Testament. Old Testament was different. Well, we've already had a quick look at this. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. That was the Old Testament teaching in Leviticus 19, which we read with Andy at the start of the meeting. That doesn't cause war. Again, from the Old Testament, how you should treat your enemy, how you should do the decent thing by him. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey wandering away, you know your enemy's animals have escaped, you should surely return it to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying helpless under its load, you shall refrain from leaving it to him. You shall surely release it with him. You're to help your neighbor. if you see him in trouble. That was the Old Testament teaching. There in Exodus, the second book of the Bible. So if you follow the teaching of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, you'll treat your enemy well. And this won't cause war. This will bring about peace. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. That's from the book of Proverbs, in the middle of the Bible, getting well on into the Old Testament. But the Old Testament teaching you see there exactly the same as the teaching of Jesus in the New Testament. And it doesn't lead to war. If people followed Bible teaching rather than the teaching of the politicians and others who took charge of the church, then you won't be going to war. And people say, oh, well, that's all very well, but really Christianity, people claim, the doctrine wasn't the teaching of Jesus. It was actually imposed by the apostles after the time of Jesus. So apostles like Paul, we'll look at what Paul taught to see, and we'll see that in fact it's not different, as people sometimes claim, not different from the teaching of Jesus, is exactly the same. This is Paul writing, repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it's possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Do not avenge yourself. Give place to wrath. So exactly the same teaching as Jesus. If somebody attacks you, you're not to fight back. That's the teaching of Paul in Romans. And here he writes, see that no one renders evil for evil to anyone, but always pursue what's good. So that's Paul writing to the Thessalonians, exactly the same teaching as the teaching of Jesus. And Paul wasn't the only writer of epistles in the New Testament, though he wrote more than anybody else, I think more than the others put together. But we see here, this is Peter. He writes, finally, all of you, be of one mind, having compassion for one another. Love as brothers, be tender-hearted, courteous, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing. So, people who argue that the apostles taught something different from Jesus are wrong. People who taught that Jesus taught of a different God from the God of the Old Testament, they're wrong. It's one God, one teaching throughout the Bible. So to summarize, Jesus taught and the apostles taught that we should, if we follow Jesus, we should show love to everyone, even our enemies, our natural enemies. We should live peacefully. We shouldn't fight back when we're attacked. And those were the principles taught at the beginning of Christianity, and those were the principles which the early Christians followed. But sadly, people gained control of the church, appointed themselves as leaders, and they changed the message of Christianity. So going back to the origins of Christianity, of course, it takes its name from Jesus, the Christ. Christ was his title. It means the one who was anointed to be king. We read in Mark's Gospel, Pilate again said to them, what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? They cried again, crucify him. Pilate said to them, why, what evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. So Jesus, the sinless one, was crucified. He didn't resist, he didn't fight, he gave himself up willingly to be crucified, and he taught his followers that they shouldn't resist or fight. Well, persecution soon came. We read in the Acts of the Apostles about two of the apostles, Peter and John, in the early chapters, being arrested and put in custody. That's Acts chapter 4, verse 3. They were put in the cells overnight, and when they had called in the apostles the following morning, they beat them and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus, and they let them go. So the apostles suffered hardship, but they put up with it. They didn't protest, they didn't fight back, they didn't resist, because they were following the teaching of Jesus, and that was that we shouldn't resist, we should love our enemies, we shouldn't fight back. We read about the same happening to the Apostle Paul. Jews came from Antioch and Iconium. This would be at Lystra. The Jews came from Antioch and Iconium. Having persuaded crowds, they stoned Paul, dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. So the Apostle Paul, who taught to love enemies, he experienced dreadful treatment from his enemies, yet he never fought back against them. A bit later on, Paul was brought to Jerusalem, or came to Jerusalem, and he was attacked by a mob. He asked for permission to speak to them when the Romans intervened. Up to this word, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth. He shouldn't be allowed to live." They were out to kill him, out to kill the Apostle Paul, yet he still didn't resist or fight back against them. Towards the end of the New Testament, in the first epistle of John, we read, "Whoever doesn't know God, because God is love." So from beginning to end of the Bible, we get the same message, that we're to love God and show our love for God by loving one another and loving our neighbor, even loving our enemies. Now that's the teaching of Christianity throughout the Bible. So why is Christianity blamed for so much trouble? Why are people claiming to be Christians going out and fighting in the name of Christianity, as we've seen? Something's gone wrong. So what is it that's gone wrong? Well, here's a quotation from a history book, World History, by Geddes and Grosset. They wrote, "Constantine accepted the new faith," that's Christianity. "Emperor worship may now have ceased," because Constantine was a Roman. The Romans worshipped many gods, but the Roman emperors tended to announce that they themselves were gods, and the people had to worship the emperor. Temples were built to the emperors. People had to worship the emperor there, but that ceased when Constantine decided that there should be a single religion throughout the Roman Empire, and he chose Christianity. So emperor worship ceased. But even a Christian emperor could not shed the concept that he was the fountain of religion. He, Constantine, declared himself to be the 13th apostle. Constantine, one of the apostles, the Roman Empire, according to him, and he sat as chairman of the Council of Nicaea, which established Christian doctrine. So he convened a conference to decide upon the doctrines of the Christian church. Instead of going to the Bible for doctrine, they held a big meeting presided over by the Roman emperor, who called himself the 13th apostle. So it was he who decided the doctrines of the church, and he would change all the ones that weren't convenient for the Roman Empire. It had to be popular and populist. It had to be acceptable to all the people around his empire. Christianity was fine, but it needed a bit of tweaking. And so Constantine called the Council of Nicaea to tweak the doctrines of the Christian church, to drop the ones that he didn't like. This set a precedent for the control of the church by the state. So the historians are saying that politicians took charge of the church and took charge of Christian doctrine. And this was the pattern for the future. In the same book, the emperor maintained Constantine's position at the head of the church. Patriarchs, bishops, and priests lay under his power. Emperors decided doctrine and mercilessly persecuted many of their subjects who held heretical beliefs. Now, if you didn't agree with the emperor, if you held out for the teaching of the Bible, then you were liable to be persecuted because the emperor said so. So beliefs were guided by politicians. And this is from the Times Atlas of World History. Meanwhile, important decisions, particularly the definition of doctrine, were made by the assembled clergy. Theoretically, these councils represented the voice of the church, but in practice, Christianity, as the state religion, was often subject to imperial constraint. So it was the emperor who was ultimately in charge by that time of deciding the doctrine of the church. This is a different history book. Somebody called Lynch, writing about the medieval church, he wrote, Constantine and his successors discovered that religious unity was difficult to achieve. They were repeatedly drawn by personal conviction and by political necessity to try to preserve the unity of Catholic Christianity, especially when serious disputes broke out in the 4th and 5th centuries concerning the nature of Christ, the nature of the Trinity. So it was personal conviction and political necessity which were taking over, and decisions on what the church should teach weren't based upon the Bible, but upon political necessity, the personal convictions of the people in charge, not what the Bible said. And that's how Trinity came to be introduced to as the official doctrine of the established church, because it was the personal conviction or political necessity to keep the peace. It would be acceptable to more people if the Bible were ignored and this doctrine were introduced. This is Encyclopedia Britannica. Origen, an 3rd century theologian, argued that the millennium should be interpreted allegorically. Others attempted to eliminate Revelation from the canon of Scripture altogether. When Christianity became the official state religion, millenare, you know what it means, was pushed to the very margins of acceptable Christian thought. The church didn't really see any need for the book of Revelation, so let's forget it. So moving on half a millennium to the time of Pope Gregory, a lovely photograph of him. Well, it's the only picture I could find of him. This is 1075. So we've moved on to the second millennium. Pope Gregory, writing Dictatus Papae, he believed he had the ultimate authority, that he, the Pope alone, could use the imperial insignia, the emperor's insignia, that he could depose emperors, that he himself could not be charged by anyone. So by that time, it was the Pope who was supreme. Really, he'd taken over from the emperor. It was the princes of the church who were now in charge of Christian doctrine. The church was taking over the state rather than the state taking over the church. Was that a good thing? Well, the sad thing is it wasn't, because neither the state nor the princes of the church followed Bible doctrine. Geddes and Grosset, again in their history book, the Pope declared that Christian kings had a right to conquer heathen lands. Some Catholic friars and later Jesuits did identify with the cause of the native people, but even their mission stations were instruments of colonial control. And in 1095, the Byzantine emperor appealed to the Pope for assistance against the Turks. The Pope answered the call by preaching a holy war. Now that's significant, isn't it? A holy war. The Bible principle, you remember, had been non-aggression, loving your enemy, not fighting back when he attacked you. But the Pope found that inconvenient, so he set that aside and he preached the need for holy wars. So we had holy wars. We had the Crusades. And this list is all specific to Christianity. The Crusades are trying to eject the Muslims and recover the Holy Land. Then the Reformation, that was between Protestants and Catholics. We had the wars. We had Henry VIII. He didn't exactly have a reformation. He fell out because the Pope wouldn't allow him to divorce his wife. So he set up a new church with himself as Pope. But he then persecuted the Catholics ruthlessly. And over the centuries, we had wars between Catholics and Protestants. When this country, after the death of Queen Mary, who was Catholic, when Queen Elizabeth became Queen, the Spanish objected to Britain becoming a Protestant country. They launched their Armada to try to restore Catholicism. When the Protestant king James VI became King of England in 1603, the Catholics were incensed, and so they tried to blow him up with the gunpowder plot. So that was Catholic against Protestant. And in recent times, the troubles in Ireland have been painted as Catholics against Protestants, Protestants against Catholics. So we have factions of the church leaving the Bible teaching of non-aggression behind, leaving true Christianity behind. Even the matter of translating the Bible led to violence. That's William Tyndale, who was actually a Catholic priest and a scholar, and he translated the Bible into English. That got him into terrible trouble with the church authorities, who didn't want the ordinary people to be able to read the Bible in their own language. It must stay in Latin. But he said, well, no, ordinary people should be able to read for themselves what the Bible actually says. And the church didn't want that. So the church hunted him down and had him burned to death as a heretic. Now, this was caused by mainstream Christianity, not by Bible teaching. So, what's our position today? We saw that Christianity was very quickly taken over by the Roman emperor, became the Roman church, but then it split 1,000 years ago. It split into eastern and western parts. The Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church in the west, and the Orthodox churches in the east, based in Constantinople. And then 1448, they themselves split into the Greek and the Russian Orthodox churches. And at much the same time, we had the split in the Western Church between the Catholics and the Protestants. We had the Reformation. But sadly, none of them went back to the Bible teaching of non-aggression. We had lots of changes in doctrine, but the Bible, of course, hadn't changed. And if only people had gone back to the Bible, we wouldn't have had all this trouble. And often these reforms and these disagreements weren't about doctrine, they were about practice, whether to use leavened bread or unleavened bread for the Eucharist, whether to have bishops or rule by the people. The Church of England has a hierarchy of bishops. The Church of Scotland doesn't have any bishops. Each church is self-governing. Each congregation elects its own committee of elders. In the Church of Scotland, they don't have bishops. And so we have division over practice there rather than over doctrine. The doctrine itself, they sadly didn't go back to Bible teaching. And as we've seen, there have been disputes over whether the Bible should be translated to allow ordinary people to read it. And some of the doctrines which the Roman emperor introduced way back in the 4th century have gone unchallenged in all this. The doctrine of the Holy Trinity, introduced in the 4th century, no one in the main churches went back to the Bible and said, well, look, this isn't Bible teaching. Immortality of the soul didn't come from Christianity, it came from Greek and Egyptian mythology. But while they argued about the practices of the church, they didn't go back to these fundamental teachings of the Bible. And the compromise on the Bible teaching on war also remained. The emperor had said, well, we must dump that teaching about loving enemies. It isn't politically sustainable. But really, if we are serious about following Jesus Christ, we do have to follow his teaching, and we can't set it aside. So, is there true Christianity? True Christians should love all people, Jesus said. And so we do have our group of believers across the world who believe in original Bible teaching, who try to follow the teaching as best we can. So the suffering caused by war involving so-called Christian groups, the populist Christian groups, the suffering they have caused shouldn't be blamed on the Lord Jesus Christ or on the Bible, because Jesus and the Bible both taught that we shouldn't fight. We shouldn't fight back if anybody attacks us. We shouldn't go out to initiate attacks against anybody else. We're to live in peace. We're to love our enemies. So, has Christianity caused war? Well, war has been fought in the name of Christianity, but it's not true Christianity. So, to conclude, the summary. There have been wars carried out in the name of religion, but in reality, they've been about other things. As Dawkins said, they've used the pretext of religion. They've used religion as a label. In reality, they've been about nationalism or money or politics. And religion has been the label, the pretext. When we go back to the Bible teaching is that Christians should not go to war. That was the position of Jesus in the first century. It's the position of true Christians today. True Christians don't fight because Jesus said we should not fight. We should not go to war. We should not cause wars. That's the teaching of the Bible. So thank you for your attention this afternoon.